the gay issue, and now let's sell it as something good. Now let's not apologize for being it. Now let's listen to Pete selling his sexual orientation in clip 2.
Everyone's story is different, but the thing I want people to hear is that it gets better. And this really was something that I would have done anything at a certain time in my life. I would have done anything to not be gay. And believe that as that reality became inescapable, that it might cost the chance to serve in uniform or in office.
Now, that's a very clever way to put it. He would have done anything. He would have done anything except not do it. What do you mean he would have done anything? What do you mean he would have done anything except what? Not do it. People have impulses. You can act on them and not act on them. You could be gay and not act on being gay. You want me to talk about that? Why do you have to act out every feeling that you have? This, again, is a product of the New Age philosophy. If it feels good, do it. If you feel something, do it. Are you assuming that through the history of mankind, more people didn't feel these impulses? Of course they did. And civilizations have come and gone. But the Bible came along, and you could say, okay, it's fantasy. The Bible is nothing but the poetry of ancient olive growers who imagined somebody came down from a burning bush. They don't know what that... Okay, but it was like kind of rules for mankind in the Bible. Now, a lot of people, no, the controversial bigotry, homophobia, this... Well, why do you think the ancients came up with that rule? Because a lot of guys wanted to make it with another guy. And if they did that, there'd be no tribe. Tribe would have ended. So they came up with, okay, this guy comes up from heaven and says, you can't do it, and you can punish and scare everyone. The old olive growers says, stop. Okay, hey, look, Max, I can't meet you anymore over there by the well. Forget about it. We're not doing it anymore. Stay home with Sarah there. I'm just saying to you, you're not looking at it in the right comedic way, which is that people have impulses. Doesn't mean you act on them. So for Pete to say that he wished he didn't and he was and now he is, so now he's selling it as the reason you should vote for him. So in clip 3, let's listen to the next one.
Here I am now finding that very same fact that I thought might prevent me from having an impact in the world, at least a certain kind of impact in a certain kind of way.
Oh, please.
It's actually very much part of the impact I get to have now. I mean, I'm not running to be the gay president of the United States. I'm running to be a president for everybody. But talk about God having a sense of humor.
Now you drag God into it. I love that part of it. That's the part I like best. So, I have to ask you, and I know the answer already. Is America ready for its first gay president? In my opinion, 100% not. And you say, well, that's your opinion. No, it's not my opinion. It's my keen analysis. Hispanic Americans are not oriented in that direction. In fact, they're very macho. They're never going to vote for him. African Americans are very, very skittish about the gay issue. They're not going to vote for him. And you're forgetting about the vast, huge number of black evangelicals. They're not going near him. Well, you know where the white evangelicals stand on the issue. Clearly where we stand on the issue with the Orthodox Jews. There's an issue. So how can you think the man could ever become president? It's just an argument that needs to be discussed because it's being presented for us to discuss. And if you look at his policies rather than his sexual orientation, they're no different than Bernie Sanders. He's a radical leftist, which is a pathway for citizenship for illegal aliens, health care plan. It's like Bernie Sanders, mildly the same as Bernie Sanders. The global warming fantasy, again, the obsession with these issues. Virtually every issue that Occasional Cortex and Sanders and the others push, Pete believes in, but to a lesser degree. And America is not there yet. They're never going to be there because why? Because it's all hogwash. Okay, when I come back, all these topics and more right here on the Savage Nation.
The Savage Nation. It's Savage on Demand.
I could do 8 shows right now. There's so many other things I want to talk about. But at the bottom of the hour, we have a guest on who's the head of ClimateDepot.com. And he's the author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change. He totally opposes the whole concept of global warming. We have to change the world. Now, I have him on because I asked him on to debunk the PBS series on polar extremes, carbon dioxide, global warming, and we're going to have that discussion. Concurrent with it is a soundbite from the PBS series, which I recommend, by the way, although their conclusions may be faulty. The presentation is fabulous. A fortune was spent on that PBS series. Let's hear clip number 2 just for a taste of it on the CO2 rise on the globe. Let's listen to O2 if we can.
For the most part, the ups and downs in the CO2 seem to be in sync with the natural cycles we see in our climate history. But as we get into the more recent past, something changes.
The amount of CO2 that we've added to the atmosphere that's now raised us up to 400 parts per million, that takes us way out of whatever boundaries existed over the last 800,000 years. This occurs since basically the Industrial Revolution, so it's the last 150 years or so. Mostly.
All right, let's stop right there. Now, as you know, I've studied this before, and I'm not an expert in science, in climate science, but I can read literature, whether it be in medicine or in climate. If you have a PhD that's from a good university, you learn how to read data. And in my book, Government Zero, which helped put Donald Trump in office, I wrote a chapter on the issue of climate in Zero Science, and I talked about inconvenient research, the Vostok ice core samples. And they're very interesting, the ice core samples. And I'll tell you about them when I come back. And we'll look at, amongst other things, the history of temperature and carbon dioxide over the past 420,000 years. And you may be surprised by my conclusion.
Michael Savage, a host like no other.
Welcome back to the Savage Nation. So let me preface where we're at with regard to this segment. Okay, PBS has a series out now on polar extremes, and I was drawn into it by the astounding photography. The amount of money they spent on the production is overwhelming. The places they take you on the Earth. The scientists look very credible to me, not like zealots or crazy people. So I watched it, and of course I knew they would take me to the climate change thing and explain we're all going to die, which they did eventually. Now, let me just preface this again in another way. We on the side that opposes this whole hysteria are not winning the argument for a number of reasons. The youth, have been programmed or brainwashed into believing this is a crisis that has to be resolved. It's an existential crisis, or they're all going to die. They're actually, from the time they go to school, taught this. We're never going to win by saying they're all crazy and just dismiss them. The only way we're going to win the argument is by slow and methodical discussion, which is what I want to do today. So let me begin before I introduce the guest. Going back to one simple piece of data, which is the Vostok ice core samples, which is in my book, Government Zero. And it's important data for a number of reasons. It was obtained by drilling down into the ice above Lake Vostok in Antarctica to a depth of 10,000 feet. Okay, you got that so far? French and Russian scientists went down 10,000 feet. They pulled up deep core samples and allowed them to look at, among other things, the history of temperature and carbon dioxide over the past 420,000 years. And guess what? The samples did show that increases in carbon dioxide always accompanied increases in temperature. Okay, do we have that? We agree on that. Increases in CO2 always accompanied increases in temperature. But the increases in temperature always came first. The increases in CO2 consistently lagged behind temperature increases by about 800 years. So that proves that increased levels of CO2 in the atmosphere did not cause warming. How could it have if it didn't happen until after the warming? This knocks over the whole house of cards, but there's more that I need you to look into. And I can't do it all for you at this juncture. But again, we on this side of rationality are not going to win simply by calling them crazies. So joining us right now is someone on our side, Mark Morano, founder of ClimateDepot.com, a great website. Mark, where are you on line 10? Welcome to the Savage Nation.
Thank you, Michael. I'm happy to be here.
Mark, did you see the PBS series on polar extremes, by the way?
Yes, I just watched it actually earlier today, and I'm actually very familiar with all these claims. I actually took a trip to Greenland when I was working at the United States Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, and heard the Danish government at the time hosted us, all the same propaganda. But when I looked into it, like particularly on their claims about Greenland, which I was very familiar, absolute nonsense and bunk what they're trying to scare us with in this documentary.
Let's tell the audience what they say about Greenland, just so they catch up.
Well, at one point he actually says if all of Greenland's ice melts, it would raise sea level, 20 feet. And then he says the same thing about Antarctica. And then they start talking about the last 2 decades, it's warmed, and if these trends continue. What they don't mention is that, and I have these at Climate Depot, and I have these in my book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Climate Change, is that you go back, and in the 1920s, in the 1930s, all sorts of sea level rise, Arctic melt, Greenland's going to melt, Antarctica's going to melt, Washington, D.C. is going to be underwater, which is what he said in this documentary again. He did the same thing, Al Gore, Florida would be underwater. He's giving the same theoretical extreme scenario nonsense, which isn't even geologically possible on any time scales. In fact, let me tell you that I think it was...
what would cause all of the ice on Greenland to melt, according to them?
Well, the other thing he does is he brings up this Venus, that we're going to have a hothouse runaway greenhouse effect. Well, first of all, just so you know, the peer-reviewed literature, it would take 12,500 years to melt half of the Greenland ice sheet, okay?
Wow, thank God. I got a few years left.
So that's, we're talking 25,000 years, and he's talking about Florida being underwater. So what he did, he had a very good production overall.
Yeah, don't you agree that the production was first class, one of the greatest productions I've ever seen?
Yeah, they had stunning, I guess they used drones over the ice and helicopters.
But by the way, who was the narrator? Where did they get this guy? He was very convincing, Kirk Johnson. Who is he? Very
good. Here's what he is, and this is the problem. Very well credentialed. His name's Kirk Johnson. He's the staff director at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum. And I just actually was at the Natural History Museum coincidentally last month in January here in Washington, D.C. And it is just all about going green and recycling and sustainability and the climate crisis and getting kids involved. So he's got a government political mission. And I think that's what he turned decent science and a great presentation into a hack documentary.
He did. By the way, the first half is superb. And then, of course, they lead you step by step into the hysteria of Greta Thunberg. And you realize why Greta Thunberg is hysterical is because they've been misled by people like this.
Well, the most frustrating thing about this thing is they just kept, like you opened the show, just this open the segment, just mentioning it. It's the temperature that leads CO2, not CO2 leading temperature. In other words,
all right, hold on. So I made that point. So what caused temperatures to rise to begin with, in your estimation?
His theory on that is the outgassing. The oceans store the CO2, and as they warm up, the CO2 would go up. But the temperature goes up first, and then the CO2 level comes up, generally speaking, from the outgassing of the carbon dioxide from the ocean. But here's what they didn't do. They kept talking about, they'd cherry-pick different timelines trying to correlate that.
Yeah.
But if you actually correlate temperature and CO2, it's not there. In fact, we've had ice ages when CO2 was 2,000 parts per million to as high as 8,000 parts per million, and we're only at 400 parts per million now. We've had similar temperatures when we've had 20 times higher CO2 levels than today. This is
okay. Look. You and I both understand what we're talking about, but I want to slow it up for a minute for a general audience. For a minute, let's make it simple. Dinosaur era had 5 times today's CO2. That's a good fact, isn't it?
Yes, and that ended, I guess, 67 million years ago. The last dinosaur died, so roughly.
Right. So during the dinosaur era, CO2 levels were 5 times higher than today, and life still existed on the planet. So,
in fact,
that's my whole point. So let's talk about the politics of this whole issue.
Okay. Well, here's
how many. Well, we keep hearing from demagogues like Bernie Sanders. 98% of all scientists agree that the global warming and the less. Okay, 98%. What percent of actual scientists disagree with that theory?
Well, it depends on the question is. Now, if you ask the question, is the Earth warming? That's a loaded question, Michael. Here's what people don't realize. Peer-reviewed studies show that the Roman warming period of around the time of 0 AD was as warmer than today. And then the medieval warm period from 900 to 1300 was as warm or warmer than today. But since the thermometers went on record in the late 19th century, so 1850, 1870,